Greetings, fellow Mark signing on, continuing the course on the history of Catholicism in the United States. Last time we covered the 17th century. We got right up to the end. The next event actually takes place in that century, beginning in 1698, but the effects of it will unfold into the 18th century. So that's why we're starting off with it here, and that brings us. We start with the French colonial possessions in North America, but from the other side. So we have been covering the Canadian French holdings and the conflict with the English. So now we go to the south, to the other end of the continent, which brings us right here into Louisiana and parts thereabout. So it's time to become acquainted with two French-Canadian brothers who permanently etched their marks into Catholic history, the Lemoyne brothers, Lemoyne. Pierre Lemoyne was the third son of a French immigrant, a guy born in France but went to New France, which was Canada, and named Charles Lemoyne. And Pierre's younger brother, Jean-Baptiste, was the eighth of Charles's children, what turned out to be 11 children, all born in Montreal. Pierre was born in 1661. Jean-Baptiste was born in 1680. As they aged, they're often better known by their titles in history books. So Pierre Lemoyne was the Sieur d'Iberville. So he's often just called the Iberville. Iberville. And Jean-Baptiste was the Sieur de Bienville. So he's often just called Bienville. Bienville. From 1686 to 1697, Pierre, the elder, made his reputation during the inheritance wars we alluded to last time, fighting to drive the English from Hudson Bay. Plunder, selling captured ships and cargoes, and lucrative trade licenses from the French crown given in reward, made Pierre a wealthy man. His success made him a likely candidate to find the mouth of the Mississippi River from the sea and fortify it. So last time we saw René Robert de La Salle found it by land. He found the mouth of the river by land, just going, from up by the Great Lakes, just down south until he found it, and then claimed it for France. But it was not known if a blue water vessel, so to speak, like if an ocean-going vessel could find the mouth of the river, and was the river going to be deep enough for a ship to go up, and if so, how far? So that was still an unknown. So Pierre was given this mission by the French crown. He enthusiastically accepted. So, accompanied by Jean-Baptiste, his younger brother, they left Brest, France, with 4 ships in October of 1698. They arrived in the Gulf of Mexico in January of 1699. So they came from France over here, and so they hit the coast and they sail around. Now, Florida is a Spanish possession, and these guys are sailing for Spain. So they sail around Florida, and they go up, and they're going to go into every bay I mean, that's the only way. They have to go into every bay and see, does a giant river empty into it? And if so, is it the Mississippi River? So they first look in Pensacola Bay, but find the Spanish there. So next, so here's Pensacola. Next, they go out into Mobile Bay. And Mobile Bay was a likely candidate. It does have a river emptying into it, the Mobile River. But it turned out that was not. It was too far west for it, too far east for it to be the Mississippi. So then they just kept going. And they go, let's see, from Mobile. See Gulfport here. That's Old Biloxi. There is a Biloxi, but Gulfport is Old Biloxi, which is the one they founded. Then here you can hardly see it there's the scale of this map. There's Lake Bourne and Lake Pontchartrain, and then on the southern bank of Lake Pontchartrain is New Orleans. Now New Orleans wasn't there yet, but the younger brother Jean-Baptiste is going to be the one who established New Orleans. But the elder brother Pierre would establish Mobile. Although not where it is now. They established it further upriver, and then later it was moved down to where it is, at the intersection of the bay and the river. So then they continue that way, going westward. Mobile Bay, they anchored their ship. They anchored off of Ship Island, there's now Ship Island, on February 10th. Pierre obtained the friendship with the local tribes, the Mobilian and the Alibamu tribes, by providing them with food and gifts. In trade, he learned of a river to the west that, from their description of its size, he thought that had to be the Mississippi. So they set out to explore it. On the 2nd of March, 1699, the Lemoyne expedition discovered the mouth of the Mississippi from the sea. In honor of the king who sponsored the expedition, the territory was already named Louisiana when De La Salle founded it. In the course of their exploration, they discovered the Lake Pontchartrain, which I pointed to. It looks tiny on the map, but it is a 630 square mile brackish estuary. They named it Lake Pontchartrain, honoring the Chancellor of France at the time. Louis Philippot, the Comte de Pontchartrain was his title. He was the grandfather of Maurepas. Maurepas was Jean-Frédéric Philippot, the Comte de Maurepas. He was the Minister of Marine at the Royal Court. So we have a Lake Maurepas also, for the locals, you would know, as well as the Lake Pontchartrain. The Lemoyne brothers had studied at a Jesuit school in French Canada, so brought with them Jesuit priests. In the year 1700, one of them, Father Paul Deroux, that's Paul, that's D-U, then R-H-U, opened the first chapel in Louisiana to minister to the Bayagula Indians in present-day Iberia Parish. The larger tribal groups along the coast were the Natchez, the Homa, and the Alibamu, although the Natchez are more inland, not so much on the coast. These tribes were polygamous. Their religion consisted of worship of elemental worship and animal worship, much as the other tribes the Jesuits encountered. Having achieved his first aim, locating the river's mouth by sea, but finding no good sites for a fortress in the delta, as the delta is just giant, mud, just 8,000 years of mud deposited. Not good building foundation. So Pierre, instead of building a fort in the delta of the river, he built a temporary base at Fort Maurepas in what is now Ocean Springs, Mississippi, in April of 1699. He left a garrison of 81 men. Before returning to France, he appointed as governor a guy named Sauvel de la Valentre, with his own younger brother, Jean-Baptiste, as lieutenant governor. Jean-Baptiste continued exploring the river and the Delta region. In September of 1699, he encountered an English ship 75 miles upstream from the mouth of the Mississippi, where he, as a Frenchman, certainly did not want to see an English ship. Jean-Baptiste approached the ship and was startled to recognize the English captain, Louis Banks. They had faced each other in engagements on the other, on the northern end of the, in Hudson Bay, fighting for New York. And Banks, the reason they met is Banks had been captured by Jean-Baptiste's older brother, Pierre. So Jean-Baptiste tried to bluff. He convinced Banks, who was just as shocked to find a recognizable French Canadian, so near to the Gulf of Mexico. Jean-Baptiste convinced him that the French had a fixed fortification upriver. So Banks departed, loudly declaring that the English would be back. That site is still named English Turn, 26 miles downriver from where Jean-Baptiste would eventually establish New Orleans. To substantiate the false claim, Jean-Baptiste did construct an improvised fortification before the end of 1699, Fort de la Boule, or Fort Mississippi, on the east bank of the river, 13 miles downriver from the future New Orleans. So that is, for locals, that's in Plaquemine Parish now, today. Pierre eventually returned. He reached Biloxi in January of 1700. He built a second Fort Maurepas, 40 miles up the Mississippi River, as well as offloaded 6 cannon from his ship to arm Fort Boule. He departed again, stopping in New York City to make another fortune, selling 9,000 furs that he acquired from the Indians of Alabama and Louisiana. When the governor he appointed, Sauvel, died of a fever on August 21st, 1701, Jean-Baptiste, as lieutenant governor, became the de facto command until Pierre returned. On his third voyage, in February of 1701, Pierre commenced construction of Fort Louis de la Mobile. This is Fort Mobile, but it's Old Mobile, which is 27 miles up the Mobile River from the current city of Mobile. Pierre then left Louisiana for what turned out to be the last time in April of 1702. He died of a fever, yellow fever. He died of yellow fever in Havana. And on this channel, if anyone's interested, I have three videos on yellow fever, on different yellow fevers in the history of our country. Philadelphia, and the other two in New Orleans, obviously because of, this is New Orleans. But the third one is focused more on Blessed Silos, a priest, a German immigrant priest who died of yellow fever ministering here. So if anyone's interested in yellow fever, check out the videos on this channel, and you will no doubt hear more than you ever wanted to know about yellow fever and its history. And if you do, then know Pierre was yet another victim of it. 2 years after the next inheritance war began, which is the War of the Spanish Succession, began in 1701. 2 years later, on July 20th, 1703, the Bishop of Quebec elevated the chapel in Old Mobile to the status of a parish, making it the first canonical parish in the French Louisiana territory. Now remember, that's Old Mobile, not the current site, but still in the area, it's still the first canonical parish. Well, and I mean the Spanish had St. Augustine in Florida was, but in French Louisiana, this was the first. In 1704, the Bishop of Quebec transferred its direction from the Jesuits, whom he did not like, to the Seminary of the Foreign Missions, founded by his predecessor in Canada. And that, you recall, that served, it was to train priests to serve under his jurisdiction. So he sent them all the way from Canada down to Mobile. The first pastor installed under this new jurisdictional reality was Father Henri Roulou de Levante. So Henri is Henry, but just spelled with an I, Henri. And Roulou is Roulleux, then de la, D-E-L-A, Vante, V-A-N-T-E, or de la Vante, I suppose, since in French you typically don't pronounce the suffix. And it was he's the one that opened the parish sacramental register, beginning with virtually an unbroken historical record from that year. So the Fort Louis, then it was put under the patronage of Our Lady. It was Our Lady of Mobile, and then even later, when it became a diocese, the cathedral is the Cathedral of the Immaculate Conception, which is still the cathedral, and so the sacramental registers followed that. So it's an unbroken record, and it's in the archives in the Archdiocese of Mobile. Also in 1704, a group of 400 refugee Indians arrived at Fort Mobile, asking sanctuary. Led by Salome, the wife of a chief. They were Appalachee Indians from present-day Tallahassee, Florida. Allied with the Spanish, and long ago converted to Catholicism. They suffered appalling casualties in raids by the English and the Creek Indian allies of the English from Georgia. So they were refugees. Their homes were destroyed by the English. So the enemy of my enemy. So So then they went to the French, because they know the French hate the English, and figured that the French would see them as as fellow sufferers at the hands of the English. And the calculation was correct. Jean-Baptiste welcomed them. Relations were good, owing to their shared Catholicism. These 400 refugees settled along Mobile Bay, and the church records show that French colonists on occasion served as godparents for the baptisms of Appalachee children. Salome herself is mentioned several times in the parish records of Mobile. For example, in the 1710 baptismal records, she sponsored the daughter of two Appalachies who were, their baptismal names were Caristo and Teresa. Meanwhile, Father Henri was concerned at noticing that the Catholicism of the Appalachies was resulting in intermarriage between the French colonists in Mobile and the young women who escaped, the young Appalachian women who escaped the Creek Indian raids. So in 1704, Bienville arranged for the arrival of 24 young French women, most likely from poor families, so the unions were facilitated. Reproduction occurred in the expected fashion, and the first baby was baptized in 1705. The first martyrdom in the Louisiana Territory occurred the following year, 1706. A French-Canadian priest, trained at the Seminary of the Foreign Missions, ordained for the Diocese of Quebec, named Father Jean-François Buisson de Saint Cosmas. So Jean-François, that's him. Then Buisson, B-U-I-S-S-O-N, then Day, D-E, Saint, S-T, Cosme, C-O-S-M-E. It's the rendering of, Cosmas and Damien, and it's who he's named for. He was attempting to establish a mission station among the Chitimacha tribe near present-day Donaldsonville, and for you locals, that's currently in the Diocese of Baton Rouge. He and 4 lay companions were killed by the tribe. In retaliation, Jean-Baptiste Lemoyne waged a war that nearly exterminated the tribe. And this was unusual because previously they had good relations with the indigenous peoples. 2 years later, in 1708, the French population at Old Fort Mobile reached 281. In 1709, a disastrous flood occurred. Certainly locals, we know the effect of that. Then, for reasons of military and commercial necessity, the French Alabama settlement moved downriver in 1711 and was located where the city of Mobile is now, at the junction of the Mobile River with Mobile Bay. The parish church relocated along with it, with the city, changing its name to Our Lady of Mobile in 1714. And this is canonically is the ancestor of the current cathedral, as I mentioned. Overlapping this in time, in the Spanish Catholic North America, there we find a report from a Spanish Jesuit, Father Eusebio Kino, from the year 1710, on the missions in what is now Arizona. By way of background, in 1687, Father Kino, that's K-I-N-O, and his Jesuit companions established a mission of Our Lady of Sorrows, Nuestra Senora de los Dolores, about 100 miles south of present-day Tucson, Arizona. It covered territory of the Upper Pimas from the valley of the Alta River to the Gila River. That's southern Arizona, that would become part of the Gadsden Purchase, which we'll cover later in the course. In 24 years of ministry, he and his Jesuit companions established 3 additional missions. He made multiple journeys up to 600 miles out, in the circuit, in the radius, and performed 4,000 well, not just him. I mean, the Jesuits and the missions performed 4,000 baptisms. He also boasted that he proved that Baja California is actually a peninsula. It's not an island. And he made this report in 1710. 4 years later, back in French Catholic America, 1714, Natchitoches, Louisiana, was established along the Red River by a French-Canadian explorer, another one, and a relative of the Lemoynes by marriage. So this guy's name was Louis Juchereau, Juchereau, Day, D-E, Saint-Denis, or St. Denis, S-T-D-E-N-I-S. Now, Natchitoches, even locals have trouble spelling this. So Natchitoches, Louisiana, which is still there, is spelled Natchitoches. Natchitoches. It was envisioned as a trading post, both with a local Indian tribe. Now this is north. Well, this map probably isn't going to. No, this doesn't show it. It's not on this map. But anyway, it's in northern what is now the northern part of the state of Louisiana, so not whereas New Orleans is in the south. It was the local Indian tribes up there was the Caddo Indians, Caddo, as well as trade with Spanish Texas. The French called the settlement in official correspondence Fort de Saint-Jean-Baptiste, or the Fort of John the Baptist. Natchitoches is the oldest continuously occupied settlement within the present borders of the state of Louisiana. And it served as a trade emporium for the produce of the plantations that were established along the Red River. 2 years later, in 1716, the Spanish established Nacogdoches, Texas. See, Natchitoches, Louisiana, Nacogdoches, Texas. Even though, well, I'll spell it first. Nacogdoches. It doesn't look it, but both of those words are referring to the Caddo Indians. Now, neither one are going to be. No, neither one are going to be on the. But just say Natchitoches would be somewhere like up here in Louisiana. And then in Texas, Nacogdoches would be over here. And Texas was Spanish at the time, and Louisiana was French. So in between is the territory of the Caddo Indians. And so the Nacogdoches was the end of the Camino Real, the Royal Road, in the Spanish-American territory. And then Natchitoches up here. So the trade between the Spanish and French could be facilitated through the buffer of the Caddo Indians. And it was there. Eventually, they would get squeezed, and they would happen to. But anyway, so that's why those two names, they're so unusual in their spelling and pronunciation. Pronunciation has no correlation at all with the spelling, but that's where it came from. So with the Caddo in between were envisioned as being neutrals, a neutral buffer, so that trade could still take place between the French and the Spanish. Just as the French called theirs the Fort of John the Baptist, the Spanish called theirs Our Lady of Guadalupe at Nacogdoches, or Nuestra Señora de Guadalupe de los Nacogdoches. In the following year, the year before, so Natchitoches, Louisiana was established in 1714. Nacogdoches, Texas in 1716. In between, on the 1st of September, 1715, King Louis XIV, the reigning monarch of France, died. He outlived so many of his heirs that he was followed, the next guy was Louis XV. Louis XV was actually his great-grandson, because Louis outlived his own son and grandson. The heir, Louis XV, was only 5 years old at the time. So the nephew of Louis XIV was appointed regent. He served in this capacity from 1715 to 1723. As a young man, he had the title of the Duc de Chartres. But when his father, Philippe, died, he inherited the title Duc d'Orléans. So this is the Philippe d'Orléans. So both Chartres and Orléans are cities in France. But for locals, there's a Charter Street, that's Chartres, and Orleans, of course, Orléans, is New Orleans is going to be named for him. So that's where those names come from. The year after his death, 1716, we meet a Scottish adventurer named John Law. Adventurer is what they called in the 18th century. That was the the nom de plume for a con man. John Law was appointed in 1716 finance minister of France. After convincing Philippe, the Duc d'Orléans, the regency government, convincing them that money is only a medium of exchange. It had no intrinsic value. Money is just something to facilitate commerce. So it would be advantageous to issue bills of credit, which means paper money, and keep the gold and silver in the treasury, in the vaults of the treasury. So the government, instead of having all the gold and silver circulate and maybe be taken out of the country, and purchasing something else, they would just issue paper bills of credit that each one would be essentially a promissory note from the government saying, this 5 francs of paper, and paper is backed. We actually do have 5 francs of precious metal in our vault. All right, so you get this? All right, so John Law, paper money, the minister of France. Law's reasoning was that such a procedure would create greater wealth for investment. Why? Well, because more paper money could be printed than was actually backed by royal gold. Now, that this appealed to the mercantile prejudices of the time, in that it provided a means for the royal treasury to retain physical possession of precious metals while still permitting money to be used in economic exchange. John Law could not envision a situation in which all the holders of the paper money would demand the equivalent gold value from the treasury at the same time. So he assured the regent the system could expand continuously. We could just keep printing paper money, and people could keep spending it, and more commerce, which you can tax. Now, of course, what you're getting paid in paper money, as tax. So, and that paper money's backed by what you already have in the treasury. So is that, anyway, he didn't get in that much detail. The system could continue to expand as long as everyone believed that in the ultimate security of the paper money, that it ultimately was all backed by gold and silver in the Bank of France, in the vaults of the Bank of France. So everyone holding the paper money, as long as they believed, okay, if I really need it, I can go to the bank and they'll give me the equivalent value of gold. As long as everyone believed that, the system could continue to expand. This was a fiction, of course, but it was essential because the French treasury had been depleted by the ruinous spending of the late king, Louis XIV, on palaces and on wars. One of the ventures adopted by John Law as finance minister of France was to use the paper money of the Bank of France to finance the expansion of the Louisiana colony. In order for the colony to prosper, it needed colonists, and it needed products to trade. No one had discovered gold or silver mines in Louisiana, but the rich soil of the river basin naturally suggested the promotion of the area for large-scale planting enterprises, analogous to the haciendas in the Spanish and Portuguese holdings, which we discussed earlier in the course. But plantations, or farms, large farms, whether they're worked by slaves or not, these obviously were going to be worked by slaves, but large farms, whoever works them, that it doesn't just happen. The crops aren't going to grow just because you want them to. It requires an immense initial investment of labor, and that labor has to be funded, followed by what might be years of delay before a return of profit, as the weather could turn against you. They didn't know about the flooding of the Mississippi yet, but they were going to learn about that. So all the work you did for a whole year, that could be wiped out, and then no profit for that year. Yet you spent money all that year on the labor and paying your other bills. And so you'd need credit. Well, he didn't have any problem because there's more paper money. You just take out so then he thought that's how it would continue to span. To Law's way of thinking, the paper money was ideal to sustain such an endeavor until the harvest were large enough to trade and make a profit. The paper could be spent while the gold actually remained safely in the royal vaults back in France. In this way, the Mississippi Company was established, referring to the river, Mississippi River. So now there's a state of Mississippi, obviously, in Louisiana. So they're on both sides of the southern reaches of the river. So and the French had both sides. So the investments were for plantations on both sides of the river, but it was called the Mississippi Company because of the river. So that was 1716. 2 years later, in 1718, Jean-Baptiste Lemoyne of Bienville established the city of Nouvelle-Orléans, New Orleans, on a patch of high ground, ironically, formed by the wave action. Comes to a point, and so it deposited mud there. So that point was actually 15 feet above sea level, unlike the rest of the city. And that's the present-day French Quarter, the Vauqueray. Why do this? Well, he did it first to assert and defend French domination over the Mississippi River, just as Fort Mobile was established to assert French control over Alabama, the Mobile Bay and the Mobile River. Second, it was to guard the river from British incursions from the Gulf of Mexico, as Jean-Baptiste learned at English turn, that the English also were interested in the mouth of the Mississippi. Third, it was to provide a deep water port for trade products of the indigo, cotton, and sugar plantations being funded with the paper money of John Law's Bank of France, because the river was still deep enough at that point for blue water vessels, for ocean-going vessels to dock. The following year, 1719, Jean-Baptiste recruited an engineer and cartographer to lay out a plan for New Orleans. This was Adrien de Pouget, or Adrien, A-D-R-I-E-N, the French spelling, A-D-R-I-E-N. Day, D-E, P-A-U-G-E-R. De Pouget arrived in New Orleans on the 29th of March, 1721. He submitted street plans in a grid pattern. This is the 18th century, the rationalists, the Age of Enlightenment, so a grid is, that's the rational thing to do. A grid pattern for what is now the Vauqueray, Old Quarter, that's what it had, but now the French Quarter. It consisted of 66 squares or blocks in a geometric parallelogram. It was consistent with the aesthetics of the age of rationalism. It included some street names that remain, such as Bourbon Street or Bourbon for the dynasty that governed France, Royal Street for the royals, as well as others I mentioned, the Charters. Well, there's an Orleans Avenue too, but it's not in the French Quarter. In 1725, this same guy designed the plan for Mobile in Alabama. But so 1719, he was recruited by Jean-Baptiste. The following year, 1720, the Mississippi bubble burst. So this was the first of the economic crashes in American history. Even though it's not America, I mean it's North. I mean the continent is North America, but this was the first one. This was the 18th century, early 18th century version of the Great Depression. So John Law had publicized the Mississippi Company as a lucrative investment backed by the Bank of France. So strongest foundation you could possibly imagine. Stories of the lush landscape, the immense river, filled investors with dreams of manifold return on their investment. When the passage of time surpassed their ability to patiently wait for profit, because these guys were not farmers. The people who had enough money to do this, these were aristocrats. They were not farmers, so they didn't realize how long it takes, to make a farm, or make a farm work physically. I mean, just to get everything, the water and the soil and, the furrows and the planting and just that. But then to make a profit from it, which would require transatlantic trade, selling the produce back it took too long. So it surpassed their ability to wait and endure. Some of them wanted to cash in the bonds that they purchased for the Mississippi Company. Now, John Law intended to satisfy these with paper money. That, okay, you gave me 10,000 francs in bonds, now you're cashing it in. Well, okay, here was 10,000 francs worth of paper money. But the investors wanted their paper money redeemed in gold, some of them, because they wanted to invest internationally. And other countries were not necessarily disposed to accept paper money from France. They wanted gold or silver. Law intended to satisfy these also, but then mathematics caught up. There never was enough, well, I mean, maybe the first few days, when they first started printing the paper money. But after that, there never was enough gold in the vault to back the amount of paper money that had been printed. So just physically, it could not, there just physically was not enough gold to do that. Well, when the first few investors got paid, but then a few others didn't, then word spread. So then the doubt was not only of the Mississippi Company, but also of the paper bills of credit, the paper money issued by the Bank of France, the currency, the national currency. That caused a run on the bank, which couldn't meet the obligation. So the national bank collapsed. John Law, the only reason he wasn't murdered was he fled the country. Colonists living in Louisiana went bankrupt. And after that, it became increasingly difficult to attract more colonists to Louisiana, despite the fertility of the soil, and that it really could, and eventually really did, become, lucrative agriculture. I mean, we still do. We grow everything. I mean, we grow strawberries, we grow rice. You can grow things down here because of the soil, but it takes time, it takes work, it takes patience. So, this is only 2 years after Jean-Baptiste founded the city of New Orleans, and it takes this hit. During that time period, between the founding of the city of New Orleans and the crash, the Mississippi bubble burst, brings us in the middle, August of 1717. The French government turned over responsibility for developing the Mississippi Valley to a newly chartered company called the Company of the West, later the Company of the Indies. See, they still had that in their mind. That the council of the company, or the board, I suppose it's the board of the company, wanted the church involved. France is a Catholic country, and the colonists, the people that they wanted to attract were Catholics, so they wanted to have some sacramental life if they were going to leave their home forever. The province of Louisiana was divided into three, to be served ecclesially by the Jesuits, the Carmelites, and the Capuchins. Friction between them was continual. The Carmelites withdrew then, shortly after this. We're not here to argue, over this. That there's plenty of other work we can do in the world. But the Capuchins remained from their arrival in Louisiana in 1722, and there were still Capuchins at the time of the Louisiana Purchase in 1803, when it became part of the United States. So a letter has survived, dated May 16th, 1722. It includes a record, it preserves for us a record of the company's obligation, written obligation, to construct a parish church of convenient size, that's the actual quote, with an adjoining house for 4 religious, with sufficient ground for a garden and a poultry yard. On this basis, on the 8th of April, 1723, 2 Capuchins arrived in New Orleans. Father Raphael de Luxembourg and Father Hyacinth de Verdun. They hardly distinguished themselves in the eyes of the colonist. When the good Father Hyacinth, for example, he refused a Catholic burial to a member of the Gaujoux family for reasons that have not been preserved, the family simply placed the corpse on his doorstep at night and just left it up to him. For their part, the colonists did not make a good impression on the Capuchins either. Father de Luxembourg complained that the plantation elite refused to fund parish churches, instead preferring to pay support for chaplains that they would recruit, that relatives in France would recruit priests. Then the family would pay to transport them, and the priest would simply live on the plantation. So they were essentially just employees of the plantation. So from the plantation owners, they say, okay, we have our priest, and he can serve us up here, so we don't have to go into the city for mass. That's the way of thinking. But that didn't help, the priest in New Orleans pay the bills. You still have to, In the same year, 1723, the first chapel in Louisiana for German speakers was built at Des Allemands, as is said in Louisiana, or Des Allemands. D-E-S, it's the plural particle. Allemand, A-L-L-E-M-A-N-D-S. It's just the Allemand is the French word for German, so this is just the German place. It's for Alsatian colonists. At this period, Alsace-Lorraine was under the control of the French crown. Alsace-Lorraine traded hands back and forth between the French and the Germans for 1,000 years. So you did have German speakers in there, and that's what this was for. Now the Alsatian colonists themselves paid for this church, and they used contacts from back home and paid for an Alsatian priest to come and tend to their sacramental needs. The church was called St. Charles, and the priest was Father Philibert de Vayouden, V-I-A-U-D-E-N. He was a Capuchin. This is the first example that we can date in writing, but not the last, of local colonists bypassing ecclesiastical authorities to get sacramental service, arranging this for themselves. I'll leave it at that. The collapse of the Mississippi bubble left Jean-Baptiste Lemoyne with a problem of making the colony profitable, cut off from significant investment from Europe. He then moved New Orleans into the slave business. The Mississippi bubble is the background for that. He opened a slave market in the new city, and he imported 6,000 Africans as slaves in the decade following, in the first 10 years, 6,000 Africans, following the failure of the Mississippi Company in order to build a plantation economy, following the hacienda model, cultivating on a large scale rice, sugarcane, cotton, and indigo. Indigo is a plant from which they make a purple dye, which is in demand. It's a luxury item, so it's for rich people back in Europe. The increase of the slave population resulted in the promulgation of the Code Noir in the Louisiana colony in 1724. It's the noir just means black, so it's the black laws, meaning laws governing the Africans, the Code Noir. The whole code consists of 60 articles. The first version of a Code Noir was produced by Louis XIV in 1685 as a set of laws establishing how slaves were to be treated in the French West Indies, which they're the Caribbean. So that's the Lesser Antilles, Martinique, Saint Domingue, which is now Haiti. And we'll go through all 60 articles, but in terms of religion and slavery, continuing that story, as we, periodically encounter it as the two things come together. Article 2 stipulated that all slaves were to be baptized Catholic. Article 3 forbade slaves to exercise any religion other than Catholicism. So for those, interested in local history, this is the voodoo. So they had their own religion, animist religion that they brought with them, and they weren't going to give that up. But they grafted on top of that was Catholicism, which they had to practice. So voodoo is kind of like a synthesis of those two. Skipping down, Article 11, slaves could not marry without their master's permission. Article 12, if slaves belonging to different owners had children together, the children would belong to the owner of the female slave. Skipping down, Article 55, a slave owner aged 25 years or more could legally free their slaves. Article 57, in such a case, freed slaves were French subjects, even if they were born elsewhere, even if they were born in Benin, in West Africa. If they were freed slaves, that they still weren't actually free. I mean, they weren't slaves anymore in the sense they would not be put on the market again, but they still weren't free. They couldn't just go back to Benin. They had to stay there and work and pay taxes. In the same year, 1724, there was a papal election. The new pope, Pope 245, was Benedict XIII, Pietro Francesco Orsini. He reigned from 1724 to 1730. 1 year after his election, in 1725, the French Capuchins in New Orleans opened a school for boys in the city. It was the first one, first Catholic school in the Mississippi Valley, southern Mississippi Valley. 2 years later, in April of 1727, the coadjutor bishop in Quebec became the new bishop of Quebec when his predecessor died. The new bishop was Louis-François de Plessis de Mornay. He was a Capuchin. He was from France, which he never left. So the whole time he was coadjutor in Quebec, he's still living in France. So he granted permission by letter for the Capuchins to open a parish, a canonical parish, not just a chapel, a canonical parish in New Orleans under the patronage of St. Louis IX, who at the time was the only French king to be canonized as a saint. So far still is. I think there's a cause for Louis XVI, but he has not been canonized yet. Canonically, this parish was the ancestor of the current cathedral, which is still St. Louis Cathedral. Although the original building no longer exists, but as a canonical reality, it's the ancestor. The two Capuchins already there were the first priests. It's the same two guys, Father de Luxembourg and Father Hyacinth. The first church building was designed by the architect, the engineer of New Orleans, Adrien de Poget. It was dedicated on Christmas Eve, 1727. It remained in service for 61 years until destroyed by the Great Fire in our city. Many of the cities have fires in their history. Our Great Fire was on March 21st, 1788, which we'll cover in due course. But in the same year as the dedication, 1727, a French Jesuit who arrived 2 years earlier, named Father Nicholas Ignace de Beaubois. So Nicholas Ignatius de, D-E, the last name B-E-A-U-B-O-I-S. Father Nicholas Ignace de Beaubois. Father Nicholas purchased a plantation from the Lemoyne family upriver from New Orleans. The proceeds were to fund missionary efforts among the Native Americans. This, if that doesn't sound right, it's not. I mean, it happened, but, if it doesn't sound correct in light of what we covered earlier in the course in terms of papal teaching, you're right. This is the first example of a Catholic priest moving into ownership of a slave-worked plantation, within the borders of what would become the United States. So there may have been priests who owned his slaves individually, but this is the first example documented that of a priest moving into ownership of a slave-worked plantation. Now, especially you seminarians, from the earlier in the course, we covered the papal teaching, which was very clear, and that this is not permitted. So this guy did not do this because he was a Catholic. He did not do this because he was a Catholic priest. He did this because he was being a disobedient and bad Catholic priest who was ignoring the ruling of Pope Eugenius IV in the year 1435. This guy, Beaubois, was born in Orléans, France on the 15th of October, 1689. He entered the Jesuits, the Society of Jesus, in 1706, was ordained a priest in 1717. In 1719, he was assigned to the Jesuit missions in New France. That's Canada, the Louisiana Territory. He arrived at his particular post in Kaskaskia, Illinois, in 1723. Canonically, all of that was within the jurisdiction of the Diocese of Quebec in Canada. But for internal management, the Jesuits considered the area between the Great Lakes and the Gulf of Mexico separate as the Missio Ludovisiana, the Louisiana Mission, of which Beaubois was appointed superior in 1714. In this capacity, he returned to France to negotiate with the Company of the Indies, which is the business entity chartered by the French government to economically develop the colony. He signed a contract with the company on behalf of the society on the 20th of February, 1726, in which the Company of the Indies pledged to cover travel expenses and supplies for missionaries, as well as to provide a fixed annual sum for the support of religion, which was required of them by the charter from the French crown. The separate contract that Beaubois signed with them on behalf of the Jesuits authorized Beaubois to purchase a house in New Orleans and a plantation in the territory for the society. In return, he agreed that the Jesuits would not perform ministry in the city, but only to the Indians, as the city had been reserved by a separate contract with the Capuchins. Okay, let all that sink in. The Bishop of Quebec, Bishop Saint-Vallier Lacroix, named Beaubois Vicar General, his Vicar General. So you see the overlapping jurisdictions. He's superior of the Kaskaskia mission, in which capacity he negotiated with the secular commercial entity, the Company of the West, the French Company of the West. But all that territory is within the Diocese of Quebec. So the Bishop of Quebec appoints him as his Vicar General. A Vicar General, in any church, seminarians, is something you always keep in mind. Whenever you see any title prefaced with Vicar, Vicarius, that means whatever the next title is, that's a person who's exercising authority in the name of someone else. So he does not have authority by virtue of his office like a bishop, but he's exercising on behalf of someone else. So in this case, the Vicar General can exercise general authority, all authority, on behalf of the Bishop of Quebec. So Bishop Saint-Vallier appointed him that in 1727, thus adding diocesan jurisdiction to his authority within the society and his commercial obligations now that he's entered into with the Company of the West. Now, notice that the purchase of the plantation, the slave work, that didn't come, that the Pope didn't tell him to do that. His Jesuit superiors didn't tell him to do that. The bishop in Quebec did not tell him to do that. He did that on his own. Now, he thought of it as a way that this would increase the funding and the economic stability of the Jesuit mission to the Indians. So it's perverse. I mean, to think, okay, we're going to have slaves work this plantation to make money, and we're going to use that money to reach out, to bring the faith to these other people. So it's perverse. I don't know what else to say. But that's what the guy did. This, in addition to being just totally messed up on its own, it gets even worse because it set a precedent. So when other missionaries are coming, they say, okay, how do we do? What do we do? Okay, well, what was done before? Okay, well, this guy did that. All right, well, it's okay. That's just the way things are done down here. So that's the long-term malignant effect. It was not just an aberration, one guy making a stupid, immoral decision. It legitimized a business model to fund future missions to the Indians. So he acquired land for the society. Now, as individual, as a member of a religious order, he individually could not own land. So this is how he involved the Jesuit order in this. Again, he wasn't told to do this by a superior, but by virtue, he was superior of the mission there. So, he did, and he was authorized to do business on behalf of the order. So he involved the order in this. So he could personally not own property, but when he signed, then it became the property of the order, and he functioned as fiduciary, and then his successor as superior would then function as fiduciary. But the order was still on the hook, for those obligations. So he acquired the land for the society, brought it under cultivation using slave labor, slaves purchased in the slave market in New Orleans, and he made it profitable by growing sugarcane for a bulk sale. The first this plantation initially covered what is now the Central Business District in New Orleans, the CBD. He appears to have been entirely unaware or just oblivious of the morally irreconcilable paradigm of using slave labor to raise money to fund the spreading of the gospel. We say Paul didn't do that. And slavery was also legal in the Roman Empire. So this has nothing to do with the faith. All right. In fact, it's completely contrary to the faith. All right. Time passed. In 1735, Beaubois returned to France, where he was assigned to be a teacher at a Jesuit college at Amiens. He then became a retreat director, and also in France at Vannes, until his death on the 13th of January, 1770. 1 year after Beaubois purchased and made the first clergy-owned slave plantation in what would become the United States, on the 21st of December, 1728, we find something more positive. The first baptism performed in Pointe Coupée, Louisiana, by a French Capuchin, Father Jean-François Ducos. Ducous, though they had no church yet, so this was done in a private home. The following year, April of 1729, we find record of the first baptism in Natchitoches by another French Capuchin, Father Maximian. It was the child baptized was the child of Pierre d'Arbin, born on April 8th. Again, no church yet, so the ceremony took place in the, well, it was a family chapel. I mean, it was home, but they had set aside a room as the chapel, so, Okay, so turning once more, so these are developments in the southern French American colonial world. So now returning to the north, and so to see how the Acadians came from the north to the south, and then we'll see how it all comes together. So now we leave the south for a moment, go back up to the north to Canada. Last time we were introduced to Father Jean-Louis Le Loutre. And so now we catch up with him again. He was born in Brittany, France. That's western France, northwestern France. Orphaned as a child. Entered the Paris house of the Congregation of the Holy Spirit in 1730. He volunteered for the foreign missions. Upon ordination in March of 1737, he sailed for Acadia in New France, which is eastern Canada. The situation he entered was even more perilous for Catholics than when Father Rawl went to Maine in the previous generation. Off the northeast coast of Maine, one enters the Bay of Fundy, Fundy, on the other side of which is a 360-mile-long peninsula, which the English have called New Scotland. That protrudes from the northeast coast of Canada. In 1605, the French established the first permanent European settlement in North America, north of Florida, on that peninsula, at what they called Port Royal, but which the English later renamed Annapolis Royal, after Queen Anne. So Anna and Polis is city, so Queen Anne City, Royal City, the Royal City of Queen Anne, that's it. So the colonists called it Acadia. Now, we already went through that, where they got that term from in a previous course. The settlers there, the ancestors of the Cajuns, developed good relations with the indigenous people, the Micmac, well, the Migamiji tribe. Later that got condensed into the Micmac, the Micamic. They were an Algonquin-speaking group. Ignoring the French claim to the region in 1627, the English King James I granted the area to a Scottish nobleman named Sir William Alexander. This led to a brief but unsuccessful Scottish settlement at Port Royal, which left behind its Latin name, Nova Scotia, New Scotland, Nova Scotia. The territory passed back and forth between France and England, some of it we've covered in the last session, until 1713, and that's what we covered in Father Rawl's life, when one of the treaties of Utrecht conveyed mainland Nova Scotia to the English for the last time. Well, it turned out to be the last time, because the French weren't ready to accept that. The French retained Ile Royale, as they called it. Today, that's Cape Breton Island, north of the peninsula of Nova Scotia, where they built the fortress of Louisbourg, with every intention of retaking the region from the English. This was the situation when Father Le Loutre arrived in 1737. So now we have to go back up north. No, it's not. No, it's this is the map we have been using with Maine, and you see the St. Lawrence River. but we need to go farther north. And I should have marked it. Sorry, but farther north. This was the situation when Father Le Loutre arrived in 1737. The local French correctly assumed that the Louisbourg fort on Ile Royale, Cape Breton Island, was the first stage of a plan to expel the English and retake the lost territory all the way down to the Kennebec River, which we covered last time in present-day Maine. That's why I spent all that time on that, because what happened to the Cajuns, the way they ended up in Louisiana, it's all because of nothing just happens. They didn't just leave in 1755 and come to Louisiana. For this reason, and because it would have been repugnant to their Catholic faith, the French in Acadia refused to take any oath of allegiance to the English crown, certainly not the oath of supremacy, recognizing the King of England as head of the church. Father Le Loutre, when he arrived in 37, was assigned to work with the McCamick in Acadia, or Nova Scotia. The Nova Scotia would be more amenable to the French than calling it New Scotland. He took up his duties in 1738, setting himself the task of learning the Algonquin language, just as Father Rawl had learned the Abenaki language. Because no priest ever has only one job, ever. So seminarians, just know this to be true. Just know this to be true. Never, ever, ever, once you're ordained, will you ever only have one job. This will never be. Because the tree of pain has many branches. For this reason, because no priest only has one job, he was expected to travel back and forth from Cape Breton Island to Nova Scotia to the peninsula, offering sacramental services to both the McCamick indigenous people as well as to the French colonists, the Acadians. So the circuit ministry, and that was priesthood then. So it was nothing that was not surprising to him that's what happened. Technically, the French lost the War of the Spanish Succession in 1713. So they did not get, as a result of that war, they did not get Nova Scotia back. Therefore, when Le Loutre, it was still administered by the English governor, named Lawrence Armstrong, based in the former French city of Port Royal, which he renamed Queen Anne City, or Annapolis Royal. Le Loutre did not visit Governor Armstrong to obtain a passport when he first visited Nova Scotia in September of 1738, because as a loyal Frenchman, he regarded the English presence as a temporary blight, soon to be removed. So here again, Le Loutre, just like Father Rawl, he gets caught. That's the downside of when the church is established, as it was in France, and being the national church. There certainly were advantages, but there are also disadvantages. So in a case where, like France, where the church is established, the priest, being a French citizen, means much more. Well, maybe not more, but it has, the valence is much higher, of a piece with his obedience to his religious superiors, because the church was part of the government, essentially. Because the church was supported by the government. It was essentially a Department of State. So he's going to get trapped in this problem, just like Father Rawl did. So this gets him in trouble. He does not. So the English, even though the French weren't recognizing it, the English said, well, look, the English governors, well, I have my troops here, so it's English. And so technically, Father Le Loutre disobeyed French law. Next, under orders from the French government, Father Le Loutre began establishing chapels for the Indians in territory that the Treaty of Utrecht had ceded to England. Again, he did this without consulting Governor Armstrong, who, of course, regarded that territory as English. So again, the priest, okay, what do you do? His religious superiors, to whom he, pledged obedience, were telling him, do what the secular authority tells you. We have to support them. In exchange, they support us. All right, so here you have a priest who's founding chapels, which is a priest thing to do, spreading the gospel. But it also has, the government is using him and using the church to attain political, economic, and ultimately military objectives. The same problem that Father Rawl got trapped in. Doing his duty to the church, when the church is part of the state, means also serving the state. And so you suffer, from that as a priest. Anyway, you see the problem. So Father LeLoutre is going to get trapped in the same box. Both sides knew that war was only a matter of time, and indeed it did come in 1740, when England and France found themselves on opposing sides in another European conflict, another succession war, the War of the Austrian Succession. The French authorities at Louisbourg instructed all the priests, not just the Lutherists, just we happen to know accounts of him as survived, so we know more about his life than the others. But they instructed them, so the French government, instructed priests like Father LeLoutre, who ministered to both French colonists as well as Indians, that they were to instruct the French to externally feign neutrality in the war, while clandestinely, the same priests were to organize the Indian tribes for commando warfare, clandestine guerrilla warfare, as we'd say now. For Father LeLoutre, this meant the McCamick and the Malecite tribes. Hostilities in Acadia continued in this way for the next 4 years, until 1744. There, the French sent a general, Francois Dupont du Vivier, with regular army troops. And they sent an admiral, the Duc d'Envie, with a naval squadron the plan was to finally liberate Annapolis Royal and turn all of Nova Scotia back to French holdings. LeLoutre was still around, still doing this kind of bifurcated service. He led a war band consisting of McCamick and Malecite. They fought well, and they were able to prevent any English foraging to resupply Annapolis Royal. But the French had not sufficiently considered the English Navy. While the French laid siege to Annapolis Royal, on the other side, the Bay of Fundy side of the peninsula, an entirely separate English force moved north by sea and laid siege to the French base of operations, which was Louisbourg, on the Ile de Royale, now on today's maps, Cape Breton Island. Actually, okay, I found it, because otherwise, I'm just throwing these names around. They don't mean anything. Okay, so here's Maine, which we covered. On the other map, it was close to the top, so now we see more of a northern view. Here is the Bay of Fundy. Across the Bay of Fundy from Maine is Nova Scotia, New Scotland, which the French called Acadia, part of Acadia. All this was Acadia. New Brunswick is also an English name for it, but this was all Acadia, the mainland and Nova Scotia. Cape Breton Island, which I've been talking about, that's right here. So you see from the Atlantic, goes through the Cabot Strait, and then that is the St. Lawrence River. Yeah, the other names have changed. So, but anyway, there's so Maine, Nova Scotia. This would have been Acadia, Cape Breton Island. Here, there's Newfoundland up here, and following. So here's Quebec. So following the St. Lawrence River, here's Quebec in relation to all of that. So hostilities. So the French had not considered the English Navy. While they laid siege to Annapolis Royal on the Bay of Fundy side, on the other side of the peninsula, the English force moved north by sea, laid siege to the French base of operations on Cape Breton Island. And it then became a race, two sieges, which one was going to fall first, the English base or the French base. The Indians, under Father Le Loutre's command, lacked the equipment and the engineering training to conduct siege warfare, and they soon lost interest. I mean, they tended to be good in a straight up fight, just in the forest. They certainly could hold their own and overcome most, but a siege warfare they just lost interest in that. So desertions happened, and as desertions depleted his numbers, then the English succeeded in capturing Louisbourg in June of 1745. Father Le Loutre escaped to Quebec along with 5 McCamick warriors who had a more personal bond with him. They arrived in Quebec on the 14th of September, 1745. Father Le Loutre discovered that far from accepting the loss of Louisbourg, the French government regarded it as a temporary setback, and they had every intention of retaking it and driving out the English entirely. So his new orders, delivered by his ecclesiastical superiors, but on behalf of the French government authorities, were, first, to maintain communications between the McCamick and the Acadian Catholics, letting them know that relief was coming. Second, use the McCamick to surveil Annapolis Royal, keeping track of supplies and reinforcements delivered, as well as the frequency and the methods of communication. Third, Father Le Loutre, along with another priest stuck in his same predicament, Father Maurice de Lacombe, they both were instructed to keep watch on the coast for a squadron of French ships bringing reinforcements to the Duc d'Envie, scheduled to arrive sometime in 1746. Fourth, when those ships were sighted, Father Le Loutre was to make contact with them and use his Indian allies to facilitate communication between them, the Indian allies, with the French army troops under the command of another general, Father Jean-Baptiste Nicolas Roche de Ramsay, and with the new French that arrived by the Navy reinforcements. As events unfolded, that none of this worked out. So as events unfolded, the reinforcements, Ramsay, arrived with the soldiers 1 month late because of the weather and the Atlantic crossing. He arrived in July of 1746. And when Father Le Loutre's scouts did sight the French ships, they saw only 2 ships, not an entire squadron, because the squadron had been dispersed by an Atlantic storm. So summer crossing, that's hurricane season, so that's something we know very, very much about. And the first ships to make it didn't even know if the others had survived. They got separated. And so the operation fell apart. The 2 ship captains disagreed on the course of action. One option was to wait there for the rest of the ships, hoping that the winds and the tide would blow them at least within visual range, and they could flag them down. Or option 2 would be to start raiding English shipping. Avoiding large-scale engagements because they only had 2 ships, but essentially to, like pirates, just to raid and sink isolated English ships when they could, especially to try to interdict their trade, to sink their commercial ships. Although trying to do that to the English sometimes backfired because their merchant ships were well armed, and in some cases faster and more maneuverable than the warships. Father Le Loutre was also unclear what to do because this isn't what he didn't want to do any of this. I mean, he was a priest; he was just following his orders, and those orders he had reached the point where he had fulfilled as much of them as he could. He provided the line of communication between the ship captains and the general de Ramsay. Those orders were fulfilled. The other priest, de Lacombe, took that and said, okay, my orders are done, so now I want to go back to being a priest. So he returned to his missionary work. Father Le Loutre, because of all his previous work, had a price on his head. The English had put out a hit on him, just as they had done previously to Father Rawl. And Father Le Loutre knew his McCamick allies well enough to know that they were getting restless, and they were not enthusiastic about attacking Annapolis Royal the English base, supported by only 2 ships. In this state of confusion, Father Le Loutre remained for another 2 months, keeping the McCamick focused on surveillance and delivering messages. At that point, in September, the operation definitely collapsed when the admiral, the Duc d'Envie, died. The general, the army guy, de Ramsay, showed up to let Le Loutre know, because de Ramsay said that he's going back to France. Okay, I didn't get the reinforcements, the admiral is gone, so I have to go back and report. And does the king still want to do this? And if so, what are the resources going to be? So he liked Le Loutre, and he said, okay, you have a price on your head. Your part in this is falling apart. We have these 2 ships here. One of the captains definitely has always wanted to go back to France, so he's up to that. And he'll take us back. We'll hitch a ride back. So the priest joined him for the trip back to France to see what to do. And the McCamick just dispersed back to their villages. Father Le Loutre did not find a warm welcome when he made it back to France. His ecclesiastical superiors regarded him as a failure, and the secular government authorities simply ignored him, as he was a reminder that their plan failed. So who gets blamed? The priest gets blamed. You see, of course, a guy who had zero influence over this, did not ask to do this. All he wanted to do was be a missionary, do the sacraments. That's really all he wanted to do, to bring the sacraments to the French colonists and to the McCamick, to the Indians. But because of all the problems that we discussed, the established church problem, the national church problem, and all this, then you just get stuck in all of this, and he gets blamed for it. He just gets blamed for it. The tree of pain has many branches. The wheel of pain has many spokes, and they will roll over you many, many times. For shelter, a place to stay, he stayed with, he alternated, he had a brother, an actual brother, but not a religious brother, but by family, or who was in the countryside, or when he had to go to Paris, he stayed with the Paris vicar of the Bishop of Quebec. Events then changed above all of their heads by a treaty signed in 1748 of Aix-la-Chapelle, by which England restored Ile Royale, the Cape Breton island, restored that to France in return for territory that France captured in that war in India. So England was looking to build up, and it's more territory that we're going to steal from its original owners and start a colony there. So Father Le Loutre returned back to Acadia in 1749 aboard the Chaban, in company with the new French governor of Ile Royale, Charles de Hébert de la Rallière. So after years of ignoring him and giving him one suicide mission after another, one death mission after another, because this guy, he wasn't trained to do this. He wasn't trained to recruit commandos. Yet they tell him to do that. So after years of giving him one mission after another like this, his superiors, both ecclesiastical and secular, made a decision. Regaining Louisbourg, albeit by treaty rather than force of arms, fueled the fantasy that they could evict the English from Acadia entirely. So Father Le Loutre got another, gets stuck in it again, gets another set of orders to resume his commando activities, recruit the Indians to do it, this time based around the neck of land connecting the Nova Scotia Peninsula to mainland Canada. The persistent raiding of the English commerce and communications led to a second bounty being placed on Father Le Loutre's head of 50 pounds in 1750. The details of all the engagements, all the things he got trapped into, it would take us too far afield. I'm only doing all this because this is the background for the Cajuns, to understand why the Cajuns left, why they had to leave, why the English treated them the way they did. There was a long background to this. Essentially, they all got shafted by their own government because their own government had fantasies that they did not have the military or the finances or the resolve to fulfill. And so the Acadian Catholics, along with priests, well, we'll see what happens to him, but along with that, they all got shafted. They were loyal to their government, then the government failed, and then, okay, there's the English, so how are the English going to look at them as, enemies? The essential elements of this phase of the conflict for U.S. Catholic history are, first, Father Le Loutre and other priests like him, following orders from the French government, did stoke violence against the English occupation. Second, likewise, they stoked antipathy and sometimes violence by the Acadians, by the French settlers, not just the McCamic Indian, by the Acadians against the English. Third, one result was that the English then demanded that the Acadians take the oath of supremacy and allegiance to the English crown as a way of sifting out the disloyal, an action that they had not previously imposed on French Acadian Catholics for fear of triggering a revolt. But now, from the English perspective, there's already a revolt, so we might as well. And fourth, since the French ended up losing this conflict, Father Le Loutre and his fellow obedient priest agents got blamed for the subsequent predicament of the McCamic and the Acadians. The result of all of this will reach completion during the next conflict, the French and Indian War, which was 1754 to 1763. So that's what's going on in the north. So now to turn to the southern French colonial holdings with Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama. 1 year after Father Le Loutre arrived in Canada, so we rewind him, but down in Louisiana, in May of 1738, a church was built in Natchitoches. Remember, previously they were using houses. It was modest. It was 20 feet long, 24 feet wide, made of logs and clay. But hey, it was a church. It was placed under the patronage of St. Francis at the suggestion of the Capuchins, which ultimately derived their history from the Franciscans. So that's what happened. And it was there were two priests. Now they had to do the circuit, so they were saying mass there, but they couldn't just live there. They had to do the circuit. This is Father Decaux and Father Maximian. By 1747, slaves constituted a numerical majority in the population of French Louisiana, and they remained so through the rest of the antebellum period, meaning the pre-Civil War period. 2 years later, turning to Spanish Catholic America, in 1749, Junipero Serra bid farewell to Europe, to the old world, on a letter that survived. It's a letter written to a friend of his from Cadiz, which is the port, as he was waiting for a ship. So the letter's dated August 20th, 1749. He was on the ship, the Villasota. So Junipero, well, anyway, I got to, he wrote, he was reflecting on, as he was waiting, waiting for the winds to turn, and he was reflecting on the Gospel of Luke chapter 9, verse 62. Quote, "No man putting his hand to the plow and looking back is fit for the kingdom of God." He asked his friend to pray for his family. Quote, "Nothing else but the love of God has led me to leave them. Nothing in this life should cause us sadness. Our duty is to conform ourselves to all things, in all things, to the will of Christ, and to prepare to die well. That is what counts. Nothing else matters. If this is secured, it matters little if we lose all the rest. Without this, all else is useless." So who was this guy? Junipero Serra, Serra, was born Miguel Jose Serra at Petra on the island of Majorca, one of the Balearic Islands in the Mediterranean, just off the eastern coast of Spain. Educated by Franciscan fathers at Palma, Serra joined the Order of Friars Minor, the Franciscans, in 1730. In religion, he took the name Junipero in memory of one of the companions of the original St. Francis of Assisi. Continued his studies, earned a doctorate in theology in 1742, served as a professor of theology at the Franciscan school at Palma from 1744 to 1749. Then, at the age of 36, Sarah joined a group of missionaries setting out from Mexico. In company with a friend, a fellow Franciscan, named Father Francisco Palau, P-A-L-O-U. Sarah arrived in Mexico City in December of 1749. Shortly thereafter, he volunteered to go to the mission field of Sierra Gorda in northeastern Mexico, where he worked for 8 years. He served as preacher and teacher. He learned the Otomi language of the natives in the area, built several churches, and the sites of some of those are still active as parishes, and established a successful and thriving mission system. In 1758, Sarah prepared for a new assignment at Mission San Saba on the Texas frontier. But before he could go north, hostile Comanches attacked and burned that mission to the ground. The church then ordered Sarah to the Franciscan College of San Fernando in Mexico City, where he taught from 1758 to 1767 and served as home missionary, meaning he was preaching to the Spanish colonists as well as any indigenous people who were in, but it's in the city, so it's, those who were in the city. In 1767, the Spanish government expelled the Jesuit order from New Spain. This is a long story to that. It's really more proper to European history, but the Jesuit order ended up being suppressed entirely from 1773 to 1814. So this was the lead up to that. And the reason was simply to steal their property, so that the governments, Portugal, Spain, France, Austria didn't do it, but the other Catholic countries just did it because they ran the schools and they had parishes, they had property, and so that when they suppressed the order, then the government stole their property. So there's nothing new, nothing new there. But then when the Jesuits were expelled, Serra became president of the former Jesuit mission in Baja California. He arrived at Loreto in April of 1768 and immediately set about the task of improving and enlarging the mission establishments. The Franciscan methodology for missions, they assume they walk everywhere. So their ideal would be that every 20 miles there would be a Franciscan mission. So a day's walk. They could walk 20 miles in a day. But so that was the ideal. And it was the idea was to go all the way up the Pacific coast, Baja California, all the way up. I mean, if they knew about Alaska, they would think about going all the way up there. In 1769, he volunteered to go north to Alta California to establish the first mission there, and that's what we think of as the state of California. During the march north, Serra suffered from painful bleeding ulcers on his legs and feet, but he refused to turn back. He arrived at San Diego in late June of 1769 and immediately began construction of the first mission post, which is San Diego, named for St. James. During the next 15 years, Serra devoted his time and energy to the Franciscan establishment in California. By 1782, he had established 9 missions in what is now the state of California: San Diego, Monterey, San Antonio, San Gabriel, San Luis Obispo, San Francisco, San Juan Capistrano, Santa Clara, and San Buenaventura. On the 28th of August, 1784, he died at the age of 70 at the mission of San Carlos, Carlos Borromeo, which is Monterey. He died of tuberculosis, lung ailment. He is buried there under the sanctuary. Following Sarah's death, leadership of the Franciscan missionary effort in Alta California passed to another friar, Fermin Lasuen, Lasuen. Junipero Serra was beatified by Pope John Paul II in 1988. He was canonized by Pope Francis in 2015 as a part of the Pope's first visit to the United States, the first canonization to take place on American soil. Serra's feast day is July 1st in the United States and August 26th in Mexico. He is considered the patron saint of California, Hispanic Americans, and one of the patrons of religious vocations. The mission in Carmel, California, containing Serra's remains, has continued as a place of public veneration. More recently as a place of protest, public protest. Because, Serra gets blamed for a lot of things that later Franciscans did to the indigenous people. He gets blamed for it because he established the missions. Earlier, we followed the transition of the 17th into the 18th century through a river of blood, the War of the Grand Alliance, and the War of the Spanish Succession, respectively. The 18th century, likewise, floated into the 19th century on an ocean of blood. The 8-year war of the Austrian Succession, followed by a 6-year period of rearmament, then a 9-year war of the French and Indian War, followed by the War of the American Revolution, then a 6-year hiatus in the homicide, followed by the 26-year period of the French Revolutionary Wars and the coalition wars against Napoleon. To put it another way, 2 generations lived during the second half of the 18th century, witnessed the fall of empires that had seemed eternal, followed by a new international order that was incomprehensible to survivors who remembered the time before. In particular, individuals in each of these monarchies involved found themselves pulled in one direction by their feelings regarding royalty, monarchy, either for or against, is monarchy a good idea or not, and simultaneously pulled in the other direction by the realities of their particular circumstances, for our purposes such as religion. This brings us back to Father Le Loutre in French Catholic Canada. In 1751, the English governor of Nova Scotia put a bounty on the scalps of McCamick Indian men because they were allies of the French. Later, this governor issued another set of instructions that included a bounty for the live capture of McCamick women and children. So scalps of the men, meaning killing the men, and live capture of the women and children. And I'm sure no one needs me to explain why that is. This guy, he was a Cornwallis. This was Lieutenant General Edward Cornwallis. Many of the Acadians, despite their Catholicism, had taken the oath of supremacy as English subjects. Figured, okay, we fought for our country, for France, and France lost, and they cut us off. And by this point, the Acadians, some of them had been there 5 or 6 generations, so they'd never been to France, and really didn't contemplate going back. They said, okay, well, the English won, so we'll do it. Whereas other Acadians refused. They placed their faith first and consequently suffered for it. They suffered eviction, theft of their property, and refugee status as they were exiled. So this is the Acadian Diaspora, beginning after the fall of Fort Beausejour in June of 1755. Father Le Loutre was captured in the course of this conflict and endured 8 years as a prisoner of war, not being released until August 30th, 1763, after the signature of the Treaty of Paris ended the French and Indian War, at which point France surrendered all claims to all of Canada. After his release, Le Loutre spent the rest of his life assisting Acadian refugees to find new homes. His personal focus was resettling those who did choose to go to France. He died in Nantes, in Lorraine, on the 30th of September, 1772, while on one of those journeys in company with 4 Acadian refugee families. He just got sick along the road and died. 2 months after Father Le Loutre was captured, the Acadian exile began, the Cajun exile began, August 10th, 1755 through July 11th, 1764. This consisted of the forced removal, or in the 20th century we'd call it ethnic cleansing, what the British were attempting, by just getting rid of the unwanted population. The forced removal by the British of the Acadian people from present-day Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, Prince Edward Island, and northern Maine. Some of the exiles were first deported to the 13 colonies, the British 13 colonies. Then, after 1758, to Britain or France. Before the war, before the Revolution, the American Revolution, 14,100 French-Canadian Catholics were recorded as living in Acadia. 11,500 Acadians were deported, forcibly evicted from their land stolen. The census of 1764 calculated that 2,600 Acadians remained, and those took the oath of supremacy. After the governor, Edward Cornwallis, the scalp collector, was transferred, he was followed by Major General Peregrine Thomas Hopson, commander of the 40th Regiment of His Majesty's Foot. He carried the final siege of Louisbourg to success, commanded the occupation from 1746 to 49, then was rewarded by appointment as governor of Nova Scotia. He led a major expedition to the West Indies, meaning the Caribbean, during the 7 Years' War, in the course of which he died. He was followed, as governor of Nova Scotia, by the officer who carried out the ethnic cleansing, Brigadier General Charles Lawrence. He became governor of Nova Scotia. Imitating the colonial tyranny deployed in Ireland, which we covered earlier in the course, which deported in Northern Ireland, deported indigenous Celts, Irish, and replaced them with Scottish Presbyterians. Governor Lawrence settled New England Protestants on lands stolen from the Catholic Acadians. In literature, the saga of the Acadians, the Acadian Diaspora, was immortalized by the American poet Henry Wadsworth Longfellow in his 1847 poem Evangeline, A Tale of Acadia. The poem follows an Acadian girl named Evangeline Bellefontaine, searching for her lost love, Gabriel La Jeunesse. It was set during the time of the expulsion. They were separated during the ethnic cleansing of Acadia. Evangeline experiences an odyssey across America, spending years searching for Gabriel. Failing in this, she settled in Philadelphia, working as a Sister of Mercy. So she never married anyone else. Her heart was still, but if she couldn't have him, then she gave herself to the church. It was while, in the poem, it was while tending the sick during an epidemic that she found Gabriel among the afflicted, and he died in her arms. So that's how Longfellow saw it. History in this case was far more horrifying than fiction, literature. Between November of 1755 and August of 1756, over 3,000 forcibly deported Acadians landed in Massachusetts. And we've already covered Massachusetts, what they think of Catholics, what they thought of Catholics. Thomas Hutchinson, a member of the provincial council and later governor, wrote an eyewitness account of this episode of the Acadian diaspora. In part, these are his words, quote, "The greatest part, by far, were seized by the king's troops, which had remained in the province, and hurried aboard small vessels. The remainder, with their stock of cattle, the contents of their barns, their farm utensils, and all other movables, being left behind, and never recorded, nor any satisfaction made for them. In several instances, the husbands, who happened to be at a distance from home, were put on board vessels bound to one of the English colonies, while their wives and children on board other vessels bound for other colonies remote from the first. But the people," and he's referring to his, I skipped down, so he's referring to his own, the Massachusetts Protestants, "would upon no terms have consented to the public exercise of religious worship by Roman Catholic priests. A law remained unrepealed." That's referring to the anti-priest law of 1647. "When these unhappy persons despaired of being restored to their own estates, they began to think of a removal to places where they might find priests of their own religion and other inhabitants of their own language." So, in other words, they left with whatever they could carry with them. Then in Massachusetts, that was stolen from them. And in some cases, they were, dispersed yet again. But others who remained said, okay, we got to get out of here on our own before they do the same to us. And so that's the next leg of how they get to Louisiana. So this is the impetus that brought them to Louisiana. Here we meet Jean-Jacques Blaise d'Abbadie. In February 1763, Abbadie was commissioned 12th Director General of Louisiana, with the galling assignment of dismantling the French garrison and preparing the colony for occupation by English and Spanish forces, pursuant to the terms of the Treaty of Paris after the French lost the 7 Years' War. From his reports, some datable facts about the Acadian Catholic arrival in Louisiana can be reconstructed. Quote, "The first documented group of Acadians consisted of 4 families, totaling 20 individuals. They debarked in New Orleans in February of 1746 from New York after a brief stop in Mobile, Alabama, where Jean Poirier and Magdalene Richard were married on the 22nd of January, 1764. And this is from a letter that Abbadie wrote back to France, dated April 6th, 1764. They settled along the Mississippi River as follows, which introduces us to Captain Gabriel Fuselier de Leclerc. A Frenchman from Lyon, arrived in New Orleans in 1752. He first lived at 1555 Dorgenois Street. In New Orleans, the street still exists. He held the position of Director of Commerce in Louisiana for French merchants. In 1760, Gabriel purchased land from the Attakapas Indian chief Canimo. This land was between Bayou Vermilion on the west and Bayou Teche in the east. In 1765, Governor Abbadie assigned Acadian refugees to this area. An improvised census on April 25th, 1766, calculated a population of 409 inhabitants at the Attakapas post. A priest, Father Pierre Didier, who was a Benedictine, he volunteered to serve at the Capuchin mission in Natchitoches. along with another Capuchin priest, Father Valentin, provided the earliest sacramental services recorded in the area. They recorded 82 baptisms and 12 marriages between 1756 and 1764. They did the missionary circuit, that was just priesthood, that was priestly life at the time, from Natchitoches to Point Coupé to Opelousas, and these records are in the registers in Point Coupé. In 1765, a layman, Monsieur Dautrive, donated property for a church. Another priest, Father Jean-François de Civray, was the first resident priest for whom the locals, the Cajuns, now we call them the Cajuns, the Acadian refugees, now settlers, for him, they built the first wood-frame church that became St. Martin of Tours Church. At the time, in official correspondence, the area was the Attakapas post, Le Poste de Attakapas, referring to the original trading station between the colonist and the indigenous tribe. Since the original land gift was more land than the parish of St. Martin required, Father Jean-François rented out some of it to settlers, to new settlers, in order to provide income for the refugee Acadian church. The next phase of the Acadian settlement, the Cajun settlement, introduces us, can be traced through Charles Philippe Aubry, who served as the 13th French governor of Louisiana after Abadee's death, and again as second Spanish governor of Louisiana after that happened, which we'll cover. As Louisiana changed hands from France to Spain, then from Spain back to France, then from France to the United States. From him, from Aubry, we learn that in 1764, a group of Acadians was followed in late February of 65 by a group of another 193 Acadian refugees. These had escaped, essentially, from a prison camp in Halifax. They got out, then they went to Saint-Domingue, which is Haiti, led by Joseph Broussard. This is a letter from Aubry back to France, dated February 25th, 1765. These who escaped, I shouldn't say prison camp because it was a refugee camp, but it was actually, the detainees that were detained in Halifax, but they were, unjustly imprisoned. Just, it was assumed that they were subversive. So after all of this, they settled in the Attakapas territory. Over the next 2 decades, another 4,000 Acadians came to Louisiana from various vectors. Quote, this is from the same letter. They had to adjust to the semi-tropical climate. Some died of malaria and yellow fever that first year. When the Spanish governor Ulloa visited in 1766, they asked him if they could invite their relatives to join them. They were looking to form a new Acadia. Even though Governor Ulloa gave them a let's wait and see answer, they went ahead and sent out letters inviting their friends and relatives. Many Acadians decided to make the trip. At least 689 of the 1,050 Acadians in Maryland and Pennsylvania boarded ships on the Chesapeake Bay and sailed from there to Louisiana. They were welcomed by authorities in Louisiana and offered land and assistance. 200 Acadians were settled in St. James Parish. A group of 80 Halifax Acadians who arrived later were sent to St. James also in May of 1765. Acadians that followed were dispersed. As Pennsylvania and Maryland Acadians arrived, they were settled according to the Spanish defense strategy. Remember, so after the 7 Years' War, France lost Louisiana. They lost the war, so they lost Louisiana, and Spain got it. So from 1763 until what was 1800 was OC. So Spain was a Catholic country. So in this case, the faith was not a problem as it was when they were controlled by the English. But Spain had its own, its own agenda. And so they have these French refugees, so they're not rejected because they're Catholic, but it's also, okay, you're coming into our territory, you're going to do what we want, and that means militia service for Spain. After May of 1766, such Cajuns coming in were settled at sites along the Mississippi River at key border points between English and Spanish territory to use as a buffer. In July of 1767, another 210 Acadians settled at St. Gabriel. In February of 68, 149, that's 29 families, were settled in Vidalia, Louisiana. They had sailed from Port Tobacco, Maryland, in December of 67 aboard the Jane under Captain Richard Ryder. This settlement turned the Acadians the way they came in, and then they were, at first they thought, oh, okay, this band, they're going to let us have land, but then when they saw that, that they were going to be used as militia, so used yet again, just like the French tried to use them against the English, so now the Spanish are going to try to use them against the English. Then they started to mistrust Governor Uolo, the Spanish governor. But they were kind of stuck. The next governor, O'Reilly, who was Irish but in the service of Spain, then allowed that last group of Acadians to travel in December of 1769 to join other Acadians in St. Martin. From 1768 to 1785, virtually no new Acadian settlers arrived in Louisiana because word spread of how the Spanish were using them against the English, and that they had had enough of being used by governments. In 1770, 30 Acadians arrived along the Mississippi River below Bayou Plaquemine, so they were no longer in that area, the Attakapaw area, the St. Martin area. They had been sailing on a ship and had gone through shipboard starvation, a mutiny, a shipwreck, imprisonment, forced labor in Texas, and then escaped. They made a 420-mile journey overland from Texas to Natchitoches. They were allowed to go to the Iberville area, which is now, Opelousas. Today, we're in the Opelousas area. Meanwhile, letters written by the early Acadian settlers in Louisiana had reached the Acadians in France, providing information necessary for an arrangement to be made between the French government and the Spanish government, so that where the French would try to attenuate the treatment of the Acadians. Which brings us to another guy, Henri Perrot, P-E-Y-R-O-U-X. A French entrepreneur conceived the idea of resettling the exiled Acadians who made it to France in Spanish Louisiana. Securing permission and a commission from Spain, even though he's French, he's doing it from Spain, he formed a partnership with Olivier Thériault, one of the Acadian refugees in France. The endeavor was complicated when Perrot was arrested by French officials. He was accused of being a secret agent of Spain. He wasn't a secret agent. He was an agent of Spain, but not a secret agent. He had openly gotten a commission to serve them in this particular endeavor. His arrest, though, that was a farce. It was arranged by French merchants who did not want the Acadian exiles to leave because they were using them. The refugee Acadians that came in, they were desperate, they lost everything. So the French merchants, oh yeah, we'll give you a job. And then they use them to unload their ships, to do their warehouses, do all their work for them. but not paying them nothing. And then they say, well, you don't like it? We'll go somewhere else. So where are they going to go? So it's okay. Well, you can have a roof over your head. You can sleep in the warehouse. When you unload the ship all day. Then you can just sleep in the warehouse. So the French merchants didn't want them to leave because they wanted to use them. So after numerous financial and bureaucratic setbacks, approximately 1,600 Acadian exiles sailed for Louisiana from France between May and October of 1785. They sailed on 7 ships paid for by the Spanish government. Upon arriving in New Orleans, they were stored in warehouses again. 4 of the 7 groups were later settled along Bayou Lafourche. 2 of the 7 groups along the Mississippi River south of Baton Rouge. The 7th group was settled along the lower Bayou, present-day Thompson's Creek. The final group of Acadians arrived in 1788. A schooner captained by Joseph Gravois brought 19 Acadians from St. Pierre to Louisiana. And that is, apologies, it's grossly oversimplified, but that is a summary of the Acadian diaspora, how they came in the background, not just, they came from up there down here, but then the background of what happened and, the desperate circumstances. And how their culture developed here in Louisiana. Very Catholic, still very Catholic culture. Still preferred rural. They're very mistrustful of cities. They don't. The cities. They don't like cities. Because cities are anyway. That and they agricultural, hunting, trapping, fishing. That's so they replicated. That went from the Maritime Province up in Eastern Canada, so they replicated that culture down here. And it's still extremely Catholic. Okay. All right. For that, we will end there, and then pick up with the lead up to the American Revolution. So the French and Indian War, which I alluded to, now we'll go into more detail for that, because the American Revolution would not have happened had it not been for the French and Indian War, and some things that happened during and after that war. So that merits a separate unit. So we will mark this so I don't lose a spot. Okay, so we will pause there. Thank you for your attention. This session is adjourned.